This week on Newsnight, Boeing Starliner arrives home but without its crew. What lies ahead for the spacecraft? Plus, the battle over marijuana in Florida as former President Trump throws his support behind Amendment 3. Newsnight starts now.
Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take a deep dive into the top stories and issues that matter to Central Florida and how they shape our community. First tonight, problems for NASA. A report out this week from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine finds what it believes is an unsustainable gap between the space agency's goals and budget, and a lack of strategic thinking and future planning. Meanwhile, 2 of NASA's astronauts remain in orbit more than 3 months after launching from the Space Coast on board Boeing's Starliner. Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams' 10-day mission has turned into 10 months as scientists struggle to diagnose thruster issues. The astronauts will now return home in February on board a SpaceX Crew Dragon instead. Steve Stitch is manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program.
If we'd have had a crew on board the spacecraft, we would have flown the same back-away sequence from the space station and the same deorbit burn and executed the same entry. And so it would have been a safe, successful landing with the crew on board had we have had Butch and Suni on board. It's probably too early to think about exactly what the next flight looks like. I think we want to take the steps to go look at all the data. Certainly our goal is to get to the rotation flight. Our goal all along has been to have one flight a year, one flight from Boeing Starliner and another flight from SpaceX with Dragon. So it'll take a little time to determine the path forward. But today we saw the vehicle perform really well. We've got some things we know we've got to go work on, and we'll go do that and fix those things and then go fly when we're ready.
Meanwhile, a groundbreaking commercial mission aboard a SpaceX flight launched this week from the Kennedy Space Center. The 4-person Polaris Dawn crew is spending several days in orbit, performing the first ever civilian spacewalk and journeying further into space than any humans since the Apollo missions. I spoke about both Boeing Starliner and Polaris Dawn with Will Robinson-Smith from Spaceflight Now. We started with Polaris Dawn.
So this is a collaboration between the mission commander, Jared Isaacman, who you may recall flew aboard the Inspiration 4 mission as part of a fundraising effort for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Same type of fundraising effort going on here, but they're working with SpaceX to push forward a lot of initiatives that SpaceX wants to use on future missions to, as it says, make life multiplanetary. So that's things like going further than astronauts have gone since the end of the Apollo era, working on a commercial spacewalk that'll happen with spacesuits that SpaceX built themselves, and doing an on-orbit test of the Starlink internet technology, which is something that they haven't done with a capsule on orbit before.
I'm kind of interested in what the significance is of putting civilians into space with private companies behind it. What is the significance of that as opposed to doing it all through the government with NASA astronauts?
Well, I think as we want to build out more of a low Earth orbit economy, it's great to have professional astronauts go because they do a very specific type of mission. They're working on, research and furthering understanding of how to go out further to, live on the moon, go out to Mars. But with this low Earth orbit economy, we want to have people more like you and I who have not trained for, years on end for these 2 specific missions to be able to adapt and understand how the low Earth orbit economy, being in microgravity, affects multiple physiologies. And so by having folks like the Inspiration 4 astronauts go up for that 3-day mission, or Polaris Dawn, they're doing a lot of science both on the human body as well as some other research projects. So if we want to have a world in which you have space hotels and places where researchers can just go up and do their own experiments in low Earth orbit, we want to have a better understanding of how that works and how we can make it more hospitable for us.
I want to switch gears and talk about Boeing for a minute and NASA's decision to bring its astronauts back aboard a SpaceX Crew Dragon in February as opposed to the Boeing Starliner. Remind us about the issue with the Starliner and why NASA took this decision.
So In the road uphill to the International Space Station, there were some helium leaks that developed in the Starliner spacecraft. Over the last couple of months, they've been performing a series of tests to try to better understand sort of what the issue was, the root cause of the thruster problems. Unfortunately for Boeing, NASA determined that they didn't have a good enough model that they felt safe in returning Butch and Sunny in an operational sense back down with Starliner.
And I wanted to ask you about what experts that you talk to tell you about NASA's call here. Do they think they made the right call?
So everyone in the room that made the final decision from the NASA side unanimously agreed that this was the right call. There were some folks that about 15 or 20%, according to Ken Bowersox with NASA, that felt like they could have potentially brought Butch and Sunny home on Starliner, but ultimately decided to go with consensus at NASA. And so there's disappointment in the room, I think, on both sides, certainly on the Boeing side, and for folks in the commercial crew section of NASA that really would have liked to have seen this mission finish how they designed it to.
As you mentioned, NASA does need that redundancy. It doesn't want to put all its eggs in the SpaceX basket. But I wonder what these issues with Boeing mean for the commercial crew program at large. Does it have any sort of knock-on implications for NASA's plans to do what it wants to do in the coming years?
Yes and no. I'd say no in the sense that as the Starliner program has been delayed in launching astronauts, NASA made the decision a couple of years ago at this point to contract with SpaceX for additional Dragon flights to ferry their astronauts to and from the space station. So they have a ticket, up to the ISS through the end of its lifetime, which is going to be about 2030.
Yeah.
At some point, they would like to be able to toggle back and forth between Dragon and the Starliner. Where things get a little more sticky, I guess you could say, is NASA has a seat swap agreement with Roscosmos, the Russian space agency. So as it stands right now, you just saw with the Crew 8 launch earlier this year, you had a cosmonaut fly on that. NASA has said that the Russians want to see a few successful operational flights of Starliner before they were comfortable putting one of their cosmonauts on that spacecraft. So that introduces the question of, okay, so you've got Starliner, if it starts to trade with SpaceX, what does that do to your seat swap agreement? Does that stay in place, or how is that haggled? Do you have maybe two cosmonauts fly on a Dragon to sort of balance that out? It introduces some questions, and I think they're figuring out the answers right now.
Will Robinson-Smith joining me earlier in the studio. You can find our full conversation on our website, wucf.org/newsnight. A note, we're recording this show on Thursday morning, so things can change by airtime. So let's bring in our panel now to break it all down. Joining us in the studio this week, Jeff Allen, covers politics for Spectrum News 13. Thanks for coming in, Jeff.
Good to be here.
Good to see you. Ezzy Castro, reporter for WKMG News 6. Good to see you, Ezzy. And Brendan Byrne, host of the Are We There Yet podcast, also assistant news director at Central Florida Public Media. Good to see you, Brendan.
Great to be here.
Because we're talking about space, first of all, I'm going to start with you. NASA says these astronauts could have come home on the Starliner. Why didn't they?
They were concerned with those thrusters. This has been an issue ever since the Starliner docked many months ago with the International Space Station, and they weren't sure what was going on with them. There was testing up in space, testing down here on the ground. After the return and the touchdown, only one of those thrusters failed. So the astronauts could have safely come back home in Starliner, but there was so much uncertainty with it. And also, Boeing and NASA want to get as much data as possible from this because they want to certify this for future flights.
I mean, this was supposed to be the final test flight before it entered into a rotation with the SpaceX Crew Dragon. We heard from Steve Stitch, we heard from Will Robinson-Smith just now. What do you think is the future of Starliner?
It's definitely uncertain. Starliner has been down this road before, right? It was supposed to have one uncrewed test. That was a failure. They had to go back and do it again. It's unclear if they're going to have to do another crewed flight test like this one again. Right now, the rotation for Starliner, it's not launching again until August of 2025 at the earliest, and there's still a lot of data that they need to collect, a lot of analysis they need to collect before NASA can even say yes or no on a flight test or actually putting it into rotation. So right now, the future of Starliner is uncertain.
Let's talk briefly about Polaris Dawn, if we could. First of all, why did it take so long to get Polaris Dawn off the ground? What was uniquely hard about launching this mission?
Well, it's not uniquely hard for Florida to understand that weather is really bad this time of year, right? They had to have perfect launch weather and perfect return weather 5 days later, which there was a lot of uncertainty in the tropics, but they managed to thread the needle and get this launched earlier this week and proceed on the mission.
And what is the most interesting part of this mission as far as you're concerned? What are you watching?
Well, surely the spacewalk that happened Thursday morning, that was really cool. The first commercial spacewalk by private astronauts. This paves the way for commercial enterprises in space, to have commercial space stations, to have more people in space. But I think what gets lost in all that excitement is the medical research that this team is doing up there. They're doing dozens of experiments on themselves to see how regular people adapt to space and adapt to these missions, which is going to be crucial for the commercialization of low Earth orbit in the very near future.
All of these things that I'm talking about with Brendan here are having a profound effect on the Space Coast. We're really seeing that in terms of economic activity there.
Very busy at the port, I'd say. I mean, just earlier this month, we saw the delivery of the new Glenn rocket, Jeff Bezos' delivery right there. So, I mean, we know that's just one of the deliveries that we saw earlier this month as well.
Just a really key part of the makeup of Brevard these days.
Yeah, and it's actually creating a bit of a problem. They're getting a little packed there. They're kind of moving things in, moving things out, and the port has actually asked for more space. So far, they haven't gotten that, but I guess you could say it's a good problem to have. Years ago, I mean, some parts of the county, almost like a ghost town with the pullout of everything after the shuttle program ended. So, it's really, you see the economic growth there. When you drive around there, things are hustling and bustling, so that's a good thing, but they have some growing pains.
A stark contrast for those of us that covered the shuttle missions for sure. We'll keep an eye on what's going on in the space program as we go forward. Be sure to visit us on social media. We're at WUCF TV on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find us on X as well at Newsnight WUCF. Okay, next tonight, the presidential debate dominated the week's news nationally, of course, but here in Florida, former President Donald Trump doesn't only find himself at odds with Vice President Kamala Harris, but also Governor DeSantis, again, this time over recreational marijuana.
The fight over pot is becoming one of the fiercest battles of this election cycle in Florida.
On marijuana, it's time for a new approach.
Giant corporations don't do things out of the goodness of their heart.
Voters in the state, which already allows cannabis for medical use, face Amendment 3 on the ballot in November, which would legalize marijuana for all 21 and older. The debate pits the Republican Party of Florida, which opposes Amendment 3, against those who want to liberalize pot laws. Among them, Florida resident and former President Donald Trump. Over the weekend, he wrote on social media, "As a Floridian, I'll be voting yes on Amendment 3 this November." That's good news for proponents of Amendment 3, including the committee Smart and Safe Florida, which has spent nearly $62 million to promote it. Marijuana companies, including Trulieve, are spending big money in support of the amendment, according to state campaign finance figures.
Amendment 3 allows responsible adults to buy safe, regulated, lab-tested marijuana from a store instead of the streets, allowing law enforcement to focus on serious crimes while providing the funding they need. It's time for a change. Vote yes on Amendment 3.
Opponents, though, object to the potential smell of pot in public places and the economic clout it would give to just a small number of large marijuana companies that dominate the market. Groups funding the No on 3 campaign are also buying ads, but have just a fraction of the cash on hand leading up to voting in November.
Marijuana megacorporations spent $60 million putting Amendment 3 on your ballot. Why? It entrenches their monopoly, bans homegrown pot, and gives special licenses to select corporations. They wrote it, they rigged it, and they're hoping you fall for it.
Governor DeSantis, for his part, has said he thinks Amendment 3 would create a drug cartel in Florida's constitution.
All right, let's get into this. Jeff, let me start with you on this one. Trulieve just plowed more money into supporting Amendment 3. What is the extent of industry support for this amendment?
Well, Trulieve sees a huge opportunity. They are by far the leader as far as providing medical marijuana now, and they, of course, see, being able to sell to anyone over 21, they really see an opportunity with tourists. So people just coming in, they can now sell to them. Trulieve has pumped in by far the most money into this. In fact, there's been more money pumped into this Amendment 3 than out in California when they had a similar amendment a few years ago. So you're really seeing just a huge amount of money, like something like 91 million. Trulieve has put in most of that. They really see this as opportunity. Something like 184 dispensaries around the state. They could do some major boost in business if this passes.
More money than the California campaign. That's pretty incredible for sure. Ezzy, you and I, when you were previously on the show, talked about the size of the hemp industry in Florida. I think there's no doubt that the marijuana business is big business. How big is it?
And I mean, it's pretty big, because I think even our politicians know just how big it is here, and the impact, the economic impact that it has for our businesses here in Florida. And again, I mean, to piggyback from you, I mean, President Trump, I think, you know, he said that he wants to vote for this, which again will legalize the pot use for people who are 21 and over. And I think another reason why he said this is because he said it would stop needless marijuana related arrests, which he also brought up during that post earlier this month.
Donald Trump, as he mentioned there, has come out in support of Amendment 3. He has also called for the state legislature and enabling legislation to maybe consider bans on smoking in public places to address that issue of smell. And it looks like the legislature may get to do that.
That's right. Yeah, they're laying the groundwork for that with some proposed legislation. This would expand some smoking bans that are already in place in the state of Florida. It's interesting because, you know, Governor Ron DeSantis has come out, you know, against this and has said, you know, he doesn't want the state smelling like pot and all that. But, you know, even the sponsors of this bill know that it has pretty widespread support within the state, and it very likely could pass. So, you know, this legislation is putting the guardrails in place, as they say, once the amendment, or if the amendment does pass, for them to implement the law. So yeah, we might see that in the next legislative session.
Well, on whether it'll pass or not, I mean, some Republicans, as he suspect that Mr. Trump might just be trying to reach out beyond his base, possibly, on this issue. Do we know how popular Amendment 3 is at this point?
I mean, I think it is pretty popular, because I myself, I've driven around Orlando and I've seen the billboards up there. So, I mean, it is pretty popular, and I believe there is a high chance that this is going to pass. I believe, you know, the former president is seeing that as well, and he's kind of siding towards that side, you know, ahead of the presidential election, which we know is less than 2 months away.
I mean, anecdotally, there does seem to be quite a lot of support, Jeff.
Yeah, any projections, any polling show this just surpassing that 60% that's needed. And, you know, so I think, you know, most people will agree Donald Trump is going to not necessarily follow the playbook of Florida, the rest of Florida GOP. Most of them are obviously coming out against this, but he's putting in his support. He kind of put his support ahead of it, and then now, of course, then saying he is going to actually vote for this. So, you know, he does call, though, he says we must also implement smart regulations. So he's obviously trying to kind of tote the line there. He wants that law and order segment of this, but putting his support behind it.
Well, the internal GOP politics here is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you have Ron DeSantis, you have most of course, you know, they found each other at odds with the Republican primary last year, but, you know, most of the Florida establishment GOP saying, no, we don't want this. Donald Trump, of course, you know, going against that, as we know. You know, he'll do what he wants to do. I think most people can agree on that at this point.
The Republican Party of Florida, I think back in May, officially came out against this. But of course, the young Republicans of Florida just this week saying that they now support Amendment 3 as an organization.
Yeah, you have a big difference between older and younger voters on this issue, and I think you're going to see that in the electorate and how people vote. And, you know, I think, again, Trump wants to kind of harness that as well. He's looking at the general election. He's looking at the presidential election. And he knows if he can speak to those voters who may come out and support Amendment 3 and maybe also tack on that vote for him, that's all part of his consideration, I'm sure.
Fascinating debate as we go into November. We want to let you know about a live recording of Newsnight Conversations next month in Kissimmee, looking at issues in the 2024 elections, like the one we just talked about. WCF will host conversations in both English and Spanish, featuring community leaders, nonpartisan organizations, and others. To register to join us at the Bev Event Center, be sure to head on over to our website, wcf.org/Newsnight. We hope to see you there. Okay, another issue that Donald Trump has clashed with Republicans on over the last few months has been abortion. He's been critical of Florida's 6-week ban, championed by the governor, but he says he will not be supporting Amendment 4, enshrining abortion rights. On Monday, Governor DeSantis defended using the state's election police unit to question some people who signed the petition that allowed Amendment 4 to go on the ballot, citing fraudulent signatures.
What the Department of State had seen was there was a lot of complaints about this one group that was supporting Amendment 4 for a wide variety of reasons. And turns out they looked, this group submitted dozens of petitions on behalf of dead people. They saw those petitions being submitted. There are other petitions that have actually been validated where the signatures do not match the voter file. So they were getting all of those complaints, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're following the law, and they're ensuring that anyone that broke the law is going to be held accountable.
Well, the Tampa Bay Times first broke the story of the probe into signatures. Floridians Protecting Freedom is the committee backing Amendment 4 and is a coalition of different groups. Brendan, let me start with you on this one. The governor says agents were investigating fraudulent signatures on the petition, but some voters say they were intimidated or they felt intimidated. What have we heard, and what are those that are backing the amendment? How are they responding?
They're concerned with this, Steve. I mean, this looks like election interference, right? They are intimidating voters based on these signatures. And these aren't signatures that haven't been verified. These have gone through the state system to verify these petition signatures. So, you know, supporters of the amendment call it just that. They call this voter intimidation and think it's Governor Ron DeSantis' last-ditch effort to kind of tackle this get rid of this amendment from the ballot and stop it from passing, because there is quite a bit of support for it as well. And they fear that this is going to lead to a legal fight, as he mentioned, just weeks and months before the general election.
The polls do show it's pretty close to passing with that 60% threshold. Ezzy, the state agency for healthcare administration has also put up a website opposing Amendment 4, and we'll put that up on the screen for our viewers to see. What are the concerns, first of all, that it's citing?
I took a look at the website as well, and you know, for them, supposedly this would inform and stop misinformation, right? Of what Amendment 4 would mean if it passes. So I think that is
what
their
the state
point.
says is misinformation.
Correct. And so I saw that Florida Democratic Chair Nikki Fried, she actually spoke back about this, and she was not happy about what's going on, and she said that she says that the state shouldn't be using this type of resource for campaign purposes, because she believes this is illegal.
I mean, as you say, the critics there basically say these are all examples of the state using public funds, essentially, to sow doubt in Amendment 4. Is it legal?
Well, he might end up being defending it in court, because the ACLU, Florida Democratic leaders out of Tallahassee, they're jumping all over this. In fact, Senate Minority Leader Lauren Book, she has said that she's looking into possibly filing litigation on this. And of course, the ACLU looking at that, because Florida law basically says that no one in a position, in the state position, can use their position to promote, let's say, a candidate or a certain cause. And they feel like this flies right in the face of that. You know, the website actually says, you know, at one point it says right at the top, threatens women's safety. So they feel like this goes beyond just trying to dispute potential confusing language with the amendment, and it actually is promoting a certain side on this.
We know the abortion issue, right, is key in Florida and elsewhere. How has the governor been sort of talking about this in recent days when he's been out and about?
Well, both you and I know that he's been very strong about this. I think everybody in this table understands where he's coming from, and you know, he's been very open about this conversation. And just I would say a few days ago, he was in South Florida, where he was at a Republican Party victory dinner, and he spent almost about 30 minutes trying to tell Republicans, please vote no against, you know, Amendment 4. And he's hoping to use some of that campaigning for November, and in hopes of getting these voters to vote against this. But again, I mean, Governor DeSantis, from the very beginning, we know that abortion has been a very, very, very clear topic for him and his administration.
We saw Kamala Harris, the vice president, lean into this issue during the debate on Tuesday with former President Trump. Her campaign is also pushing the issue here in Florida as well. What's the strategy in our state as far as the Democrats are concerned?
They are pushing for this. We've seen it in the debate, as you mentioned. Harris and Trump both spoke about it in the debate, and we are starting to see the candidates come to Florida, and especially Democrats. They're hoping that this is going to turn out more voters in their favor, especially women, with Amendment 3, younger people. They're really hoping that these issues bring people to the polls.
I mean, is there an indication, do you think, Jeff, that abortion as an issue will bring people to the polls? It's not necessarily been the case that it has benefited Democrats in other states where it's appeared on the ballot.
It is very interesting when you look at different demographics and groups of people. It's not at the top of everyone's list, but when you look at women specifically, it is typically those top at least three, if not the top issue. And so I think they really feel like, you had a situation in Florida where, it was looked at completely red state, out of Democrats' hands. There is some real thought among Democrats in the state that this Florida could be back into play. Now, we'll see if that happens in November or not, but I think they feel like attaching this issue to, let's say, the presidential election, if you can get folks coming out for this and voting on abortion, this issue, it could transfer potentially to the other races as well.
And you're out talking to people all the time. Do you think it's motivating them?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, just a couple of months ago when this all happened, I don't think people knew that Floridians were going to have the opportunity to vote on this. I think we were a little blindsided, but there it is. It's coming up in November. Again, we're just so close to that. And I think people are talking. I think people are reading and educating themselves about this because they want to know what they're going to vote for.
Yet another thing for voters to consider as we go towards November. You can find a link to the full text of Amendments 3 and 4 and the campaign finance activity of those sponsoring the amendments on our website, wcf.org/Newsnight. You'll also find past episodes of Newsnight there as well, also on YouTube, the PBS app, and wherever you get your podcasts. But that is all the time we have for this week. My thanks to Jeff Allen, Spectrum News 13, Ezzy Castro, WKMG News 6, Brendan Byrne from Central Florida Public Media. Thank you so much for coming in, guys. Really appreciate your time. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.